This is fundamentally a tale of my relationship with two banks, Bankwest and ultimately the CBA, over a 7-year period between 2005 and 2009, and after that through litigation. The two relationships will be contrasted by a very constructive working and collaborative professional relationship with Bankwest until such time as they were taken over by the CBA on the 19th of December 2008. At that time, relations with the CBA-driven Bankwest collapsed virtually, and there was an appalling set of circumstances presented to me by the CBA and their treatment of me during that period. It's important to point out at this stage that before the CBA took over Bankwest, I was a successful property developer and consultant for some 35 years. I'd never lost any money on any project. In fact, I'd delivered profitable, often award-winning projects over a long period of time. It's also very important to note, which is often lost in considerations of this whole matter, that my arrangements and my bankers were Bankwest. They were never CBA. I didn't seek to do a deal with CBA. I didn't want to have relations with CBA, and the entire relationship with CBA was in fact forced upon me by virtue of their takeover of Bankwest in December 2008. Clearly I had absolutely no say in that whatsoever. By way of introduction, the banking relationship centred around the Whisper Bay project at Airlie Beach in Queensland. This was a luxury 5-star resort developed by me through negotiations with Bankwest in 2005 and 2006, which resulted in an agreement for Bankwest to fund the development of this project to the tune of some $160 million. Prior to the takeover of Bankwest by CBA in December, relationships between myself and Bankwest were excellent. They were mutually respectful and constructive at all times. From day one, Bankwest were an enthusiastic participant in the project. Understandably, prior to lending on this project, they undertook very extensive due diligence over nearly 12 months on myself as the developer, the project itself, the fundamentals, the marketplace, with all the usual checks and balances, extensive valuations by third parties, and other advice from a variety of other specialist consultants. All of those things were acceptable to the bank. In fact, so much so that they were keen and provided a 100% debt facility. And in fact, by way of example, the head of property of Bankwest, John Lamarca at the time, wanted to buy an apartment from us but was unable to do so due to conflict of interest. But he was very keen on the project. Bankwest, under the structure of the deal, were to share in profits with me, and Bankwest took the first $6 million of profits out of an estimated profit of between $80 and $100 million. In addition to that, Bankwest offered home loans to individual purchasers on very attractive terms and conditions, and that was part of the package. We commenced construction of the project in February 2007 and completed the project on time and on budget in November 2008. The completed resort was voted in the top 10 in the world. Shortly after the commencement of construction, whilst we always intended it to be run as a managed resort, our advisors suggested to us that it had true international standard, and as such we wanted to develop it into a luxury hotel. This required an upgrading of certain facilities and a further $10 million facility from Bankwest, which they were happy to provide based on the advice of our consultants and their own review. It's important to note that during construction, and with Bankwest's enthusiastic involvement at all time, we achieved some absolutely critical milestones in relation to the sound financial fundamentals of the project. Primarily, we'd secured $106 million in pre-sales to high net worth individuals and corporations around the country, both in Australia and overseas. This represented roughly at the time about a third of the project's value, notionally valuing the project at some $325 million. During that period, with the assistance of His Royal Highness the Duke of York, who at the time was the British economic envoy to the Middle East, we enjoyed his support with high-level introductions to the big Middle East sovereign investment funds of ADIA, Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, Qatari DR and Mubadala, also with the Dubai royal family. The net result of this relationship was that I spent 6 months in the Middle East between July and December 2008 and concluded a deal with the Dubai royal family, the 5th wealthiest family in the world, to manage the completed resort under one of their hotel brands called ESC. In addition, we established a Middle East-based dedicated investment fund to raise another $200 million to invest in this and other Australian projects based on the big sovereign wealth funds in the region. These were massive milestones to achieve, particularly in the context of the deteriorating market conditions in 2008. Talking of the deteriorating market conditions, just as a sideline, we became concerned during 2008, probably about the middle of 2008, when we heard rumours that Bankwest parent at that stage, HBOS in London, who were the 5th largest bank in the world, was experiencing some financial difficulty. Under those circumstances, we obviously made some inquiries, but we were thoroughly reassured when the head of Bankwest Property Finance in New South Wales wrote to us and said they were excited that Lloyds had just taken over and they got 100% bigger and were more important than they were before. But perhaps more relevantly, the head of Bankwest, Simon Walsh, and Federal Government Minister Nick Sherry stated it on ABC Radio that Bankwest were highly capitalised and highly liquid. I also took the opportunity again through His Royal Highness Prince Andrew to contact the Managing Director of HBOS in London, Gordon Grieve, who told me that they were relaxed about our loan, having checked with the Australian counterparts. Under those circumstances, we continued building, spending money, going into further debt in good faith, thinking that we were with a bank of great strength and stability. By the time we'd come to the conclusion of the development, or certainly in the latter half of 2008, the bank had revalued our project down from $350 million to $255 million. This was a third-party independent valuation done by Savills. However, our peak debt at that time to Bankwest was $175 million, which meant that we stood to make a minimum profit of at least $80 million. By then, we'd also concluded arrangements on the hotel management with the Dubai royal family, which would have produced an annual income in excess of $10 million per annum, growing to $20 million per annum over 5 years. In hindsight, and with the benefit of time and Senate inquiries and other investigations, we now know that during that period Bankwest was effectively broke, or at least HBOS was. They may have even been trading insolvently. CBA were in negotiations to buy Bankwest at some stage during 2008, probably the second half, and CBA did in fact end up buying Bankwest on the 19th of December. All this information was withheld from us at the time, and in fact patently false information was given to us, particularly in relation to the solvency of Bankwest and HBOS. Following completion of the project in late November 2008, standard banking procedure, and indeed our imperative, was clearly to settle the pre-sales of $106 million and reduce our debt from $175 million to $75 million. We also wanted to establish the hotel resort operations with the Dubai royal family to produce $10 million a year income, which would have easily covered any residual debt. And we were also anxious to launch our Middle East investment fund, already established in Guernsey, to raise another $250 million to invest in this and other projects. All this was set out in very comprehensive detail in a report to Bankwest in December 2008, in fact dated the 8th of December, 10 days before the CBA takeover. We now know that when CBA took over Bankwest on the 19th of December, they had in place a clawback arrangement where they could in fact reduce the price of Bankwest by any impaired loans. This has been widely debated and reviewed in the public domain, but I'm about to put some more intense light on it. It was in CBA's interest to impair those loans under the clawback because it provided from CBA an effective guarantee from Bankwest where they could gain from the vendors of Bankwest, which was HBOS, Lloyds, and at that stage the British government, for full recovery of the Whisper Bay debt rather than working with us in an orderly workout situation. Understandably, a workout situation may have taken longer and involved slightly more risk, so CBA merely opted for the easy way out by collapsing the entire project and charging the British government for the full loan recovery under the clawback. At no stage during this period did we know that even Bankwest had been taken over by CBA. We were not told that our loan was impaired, and at no point were we formally advised in any way about the dealings between Bankwest and CBA, and we certainly had no discussions or meetings or emails or correspondence of any kind with CBA, which I find absolutely extraordinary given we were talking about a $175 million facility.
Emphasise that point. At no time were you told that your firm was in default in relation to any of the arrangements, the contractual arrangements that you had with them?
Absolutely not, Senator. And nor were we. our loan was due to expire, which I'll come to, in the 15th of January 2009, and we were under a capitalised interest regime. We'd finished the project. There was no default to it. So the loan was due to expire on the 15th of January 09, and clearly we'd been talking to Bankwest for a long period of time before that about how we would deal with that rollover at expiration. It's important to note that with $106 million of pre-sales sitting in Mallison's trust account, we were talking about rolling over $70-odd million, not $175 or $180 million. The imperative being to obviously settle the pre-sales and reduce the debt. Bankwest, under the circumstances, had been talking to us for probably 6 or 8 months before that, and as evidenced by the fact that they had me in the Middle East from July to December 08, negotiating with high-profile members of the Arab community to secure the hotel resort operations and the investment fund. We actually signed the arrangement with the Dubai royal family in relation to the management of the hotel on the 25th of November 08. Bankwest actually paid monies pursuant to that arrangement in late 08 and early 09 in anticipation of the rollover. Bankwest instructed us in February 09 to engage all the consultants necessary to launch the hotel operations. That was in fact after the loan expiry date. And Bankwest also instructed us to pursue the launch of the Middle East Investment Fund in December and January 09, again totally consistent with what we discussed with the bank. In February 09, again after the loan expiry, Bankwest met with the representatives of ESC Hotels and Resorts at the Observatory Hotel and undertook to release the balance of the funding tranche under the deal no later than the first week in March. ESC was surprised at the delays that the bank were indicating under the CBA regime, which we now know, and suggested to me at the time, are they looking for a bribe or something? Why are they holding things up? I explained it doesn't work that way in Australia. But they were totally perplexed as to why they were going so slow. We now know it's because of the influence of CBA. When the promised funds weren't forthcoming, S wrote to Bankwest on at least 3 separate occasions reminding them of the deal. Bankwest never refuted any of those discussions about the deal, and to the contrary wrote to ESC apologising for the delays in releasing the fund. We now know, as I said, with hindsight, that these were in fact the early signs of CBA's influence over the Bankwest matter and this deal. It's an appropriate time to acknowledge the entrance of CBA into the situation. So by this stage we were at Christmas 2008, and our imperative was clearly to settle the pre-sales, to reduce our debt, to establish the hotel resort operations and the associated cash flow, and launch the Middle East Investment Fund to bring in more funds. During this period, inexplicably, Bankwest, under the CBA regime, became slow to pay us and our consultants, and despite the signed agreements with consultants to progress things, they were very slow to pay and often delayed for weeks, if not months at a time. Mallisons themselves, who are our lawyers acting, were frustrated by lack of instructions and decisions by Bankwest CBA during this period, and the dramatically needed reduction of debt via the pre-sales was frustrated by deliberate delays in decisions to the extent that Mallisons had to write to the bank saying, we're disappointed that we can't get instructions from you. In late February and early March 09, Bankwest CBA would not confirm nor deny they were proceeding with our loan renewal. This just left us frozen and starved of financial oxygen, and we had nowhere to go. This is deliberate strategy by CBA led to the inevitable conclusion of receivership ultimately on the 6th of April 2009. This is the first we knew we were in any trouble. CBA gave us notice, 48 hours to repay $178 million, accompanied by an $82,000 legal fee.
How long was that, sorry?
48 hours. Accompanied by an $82,000 legal bill for a 1.5-page standard letter. How much was that? $82,000. This was the trigger mechanism that provided the ability for CBA to exercise formally the clawback of funds under the sale agreement with HBOS. I've noted in previous Senate inquiries and other public statements by CBA they like to work with their customers. Clearly this is just farcical. The mere fact that there was no discussion or decision of any kind for CBA for almost 5 months between November 08 and April 09 clearly renders normal, responsible commercial operations impossible. This was a deliberate starvation of our financial oxygen, and in and of itself is unconscionable conduct. How can anybody possibly operate in a total vacuum when you're trying to do business in a normal arm's length manner over a $178 million deal relating to a $250 million project that sits completed? I maintain prior to the CBA takeover, Bankwest had agreed to roll over our loan at its expiration through its words and deeds and actions. It was not at all surprising, and in fact it's totally consistent with normal commercial banking and practice. Roll over our loan was in fact the only financial responsible logical course of action. This is well-established banking procedure. To do anything else at all was just financial suicide, certain to destroy the project's value and create massive losses. Therefore, the central burning question is, why would a bank of CBA's calibre and capacity do such an illogical and unusual thing? And the answer lies elsewhere, and this committee is going to find it out. Quite simply, they were either totally inept or they had another agenda. In mid-2010, as predicted by me, CBA's receivers caught Amantha sold Whisper Bay for just $56 million. That is half the value of the $106 million in sales we already held. It's an 80% discount to the 2008 valuation of $255 million and less than 1/3 of the actual cost to build the development. Inexplicably, Court Amantha, the receivers, failed to attempt to mitigate any of the losses. They did not settle a single pre-sale out of the $106 million. They did not proceed with a signed management agreement with S Hotels and Resorts of Dubai, and they failed to launch the Middle East investment fund poised to bring in $250 million. Basically, these actions, or more accurately, deliberate inactions by CBA and their receivers, were financially extraordinary and inexplicable and represent a complete departure from normal banking and commercial practice. Consequently, in early 2011, CBA issued a demand against me personally and my companies for a $122 million shortfall, which was caused by their own unconscionable conduct. Following dialogue with CBA's lawyers, I wrote to them offering a mutual walk-away settlement. Their response was, "We have been instructed to go hard against you" by CBA. Subsequent comprehensive submissions along these lines were sent deliberately by me to Mr Ian Narrov, David Cohen and Chairman David Turner of the CBA to explain to them in infinite detail the actuality of the situation. I did that quite deliberately to ensure that they were fully informed and had no wriggle room left. Following the two Senate inquiries and more relevantly perhaps the obtaining of the discovery evidence through my case, we now know several key issues. One was that CBA did in fact benefit from a clawback under the sale agreement. CBA improperly tried to influence Bankwest to impair our loans. CBA's attempt to impair our loan was contested by HBOS Lloyds, understandably, as the vendors, and sent to the appointed arbiter, Ernst & Young. Ernst & Young found that our loan was in fact stable and ultimately unimpaired and refused to allow the clawback of CBA. This was all denied by CBA in recent Senate inquiries. CBA Bankwest misrepresented that they'd roll over our loan. They reneged on the management contract and they reneged on the launch of the Middle East Investment Fund. They also reneged on all of the pre-sales totalling $106 million. There were also compelling reasons at the time why CBA wanted to impair and default many of these inherited loans from Bankwest to meet their Basel II liquidity requirements. This is a crucial issue peculiar to the banking industry, which has been somewhat overlooked in this saga, but I believe more light will be put on it today. As a result of these actions and CBA's demands against me, the matter proceeded to court. CBA's issued the recovery proceedings to me for $122 million on the 28th of January 2011 and were clearly intent on pursuing me to bankruptcy despite the fact they knew I had no assets to give. To defend myself, I engaged lawyers, Mr Andrew Sutherland, to represent me. On the 4th of March 2011, I wrote a comprehensive letter as stated above to CBA's lawyers requesting a meeting and dialogue on a without prejudice basis and a walk-away settlement. This was rejected by CBA. CBA's first tactic in the court case was to rely on so-called suspension clauses to effectively deny me the right to even undertake litigation against them until the full debt of $122 million had been paid. I originally lost this case before Justice McDougall in April 2012. This left me totally exposed to CBA's bankruptcy agenda. Upon advice of my lawyers, I decided to appeal that decision That appeal took place in January 2013, and the original judgment of McDougall was unanimously overturned by 3 senior Supreme Court judges. This was a landmark law-changing decision to the extent that CBA lawyers issued notice to all their clients warning them they could no longer rely on suspension clauses to stifle claims against them. The costs awarded me in the Supreme Court of some $40,000 were to be paid by CBA, but they steadfastly refused to pay. Despite several formal requests, demands and a court order, CBA still refused to pay those costs, and this necessitated sending in the Sheriff of New South Wales to collect the debt. CBA lied to the Sheriff, saying that this was a Bankwest matter, despite the fact that they had assumed all Bankwest assets and liabilities before this date formally. This blatant lie was castigated by Justice Sakar for wasting the court's time, and eventually CBA paid. This was part of CBA's agenda to drag out the case as long as possible, to exhaust me financially, physically and emotionally. This is standard operating procedures for CBA, and is simply a form of financial bullying accommodated by the Australian court legal system. How can any individual hope to take on a bank in the courts that makes $10 billion a year? During this discovery process, however, it was definitively established through indisputable written evidence that, pursuant to the provisions of the sale contract, CBA did in fact attempt to claw back our loan from the vendors of Bankwest through their advisors Pricewaterhouse. The attempt at this clawback was contested by the vendors, effectively the British government, through their advisors KPMG, and their position was that our loan was in fact stable and effectively unimpaired. The matter was then referred to the independent arbiter Ernst & Young, who also found that our loan was stable and unimpaired. Clearly and consistent with Bankwest's original opinion, our loan was stable and unimpaired, and the associated workout process put forward by us in December 2008 was entirely workable, reasonable solution consistent with normal banking commercial practice. The case was finally due to be heard in May 2014. In January 2014, I received a letter from David Cohen suggesting that there might be some scope to talk about a reasonable settlement. I answered that letter at the time and offered to meet him. He dragged this out until Tuesday, the 29th of April 2014, 1 week before the trial. The meeting was held at CBA's head office with my advisor at the time, Leon Zweier of Arnold Block Liebler, and Mr Cohen and another CBA executive. Under extreme duress, I very reluctantly agreed to a paltry settlement of $1.8 million offered by Mr Cohen. Mr Cohen at the time said, "This is subject to an internal stamping, but they always do what I say." The paperwork was to be completed within 24 hours so as not to waste further court and lawyers' time. At the meeting, Cohen stated to me that they were keen to settle with me as they had not had time to do proper due diligence under the Bankwest purchase, and my loan was in fact one of the loans that they had tried to claw back from Bankwest vendors.
Could you just repeat that, please, what you just said then?
At the meeting, Mr Cohen stated to me that they were keen to settle with me as they had not had time to do proper due diligence on the Bankwest purchase, and my loan was in fact one of the loans they had tried to claw back from Bankwest vendors HBOS.
The only question is there any, I mean, these are settlement discussions. Was there anything in writing or any corroboration of what you are asserting?
Other than the attendance of Leon Zweier, who corroborated.
But it was all oral?
All oral.
Thank you.
Do you have a statement or a stat dec or anything from your witness?
No, but I believe he was going to be called before the inquiry.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
He's a senior partner at Arnold Block Liebler.
No, I understood that.
Despite the handshake agreement, well, it was more than a handshake agreement, an agreement at that meeting, CBA delayed any further communication with me until the very last minute, after close of business on Friday the 2nd of May, with the court case due to start in the morning of the 5th of May. Finally, at about 6 o'clock, CBA produced a take it or leave it confidential final settlement, totally contrary to our agreement to pay me $1.8 million, and offering to pay me a mere $100,000 toward my court costs, provided I signed both a strict confidentiality agreement and agreed to a press release saying that CBA had done no wrong and that my claims against them were effectively baseless. At that point, I was emotionally, physically, financially exhausted, and on the advice of Mr Leon Zweier, I very reluctantly accepted that settlement.
Thank you, Mr O'Brien, and can I thank you for the clarity in which you revealed that very, very complex narrative to us and to the people who might be listening to the broadcast today through the Parliament and others who I know are watching this inquiry with great interest.
Thanks, sir.
I want to just go through and ask a couple of questions about the evidence that you've given. Can you take me through, towards the end of your statement, you talked about the stable and unimpaired nature of your loan, and you spoke about the interaction between the British government and the Australian entities that were relevant. So could you just take me back to that latter part of your evidence and go through it one more time for me?
This evidence came out through the discovery process. In my case, of course, we didn't know about it until we saw it. And how the mechanism worked under the clawback and share sale deed was that CBA had Price Waterhouse representing them, and HBOS Lloyds had KPMG. So loans were to be categorised as impaired or unimpaired, and the two respective firms of accountants had to come to an agreement and categorise them as such. If they didn't come to agreement, it had a third-party arbiter who was Ernst & Young. My loan went through that process and was found to be unimpaired, effectively.
You spoke about a period of time where the decision around what to do with with a series of loans involved the opportunity for the Commonwealth Bank to get basically a guarantee from the British government for the purchase of that loan. So could you go back to that section quite early in your evidence and just explain that to me? And then you followed up by saying that you were given no advice that this was happening, this process. You were completely unaware of that. So I want to go to the initial options that were available to the CBA in that moment of purchase and planning for that.
Yep.
And then secondly, if you can go to the communications with you, or the lack thereof, between January 15, between December 2008, through again to April. Thank you. So if you can go back to that with a little bit more detail. So the first thing, the British government guarantee.
The answer to your first question, the sequence of events was as such, which we didn't know at the time, but we now know in hindsight, that in about September 2008, HBOS, who were the owners, Halifax Bank of Scotland, who were the owners of Bankwest, got into financial trouble. Over a weekend, the then British Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, negotiated a deal for Lloyds TSB to take out HBOS to stabilise the situation. Lloyds choked on that deal. It was too big and it was too rushed, and the whole of that amalgamated banking system became unstable. And I think it was in October that the British government stepped in, it might have been November, and effectively nationalised and took over 50% of that banking syndicate. So by extrapolation, the British government were then the owners of Bankwest, being a wholly owned subsidiary of HBOS. Mm-hmm. And you're right onto it, Senator. That's a critical element. My masters, as a borrower of Bankwest, were the British government. Therefore, any clawback or any financial adjustment or restitution of any kind back from CBA was effectively to and responsible by the British government.
So if I can put this in layman's terms, at the juncture where this was occurring, the CBA had a choice either to take the risk with some loans that were out there.
Yeah.
You know, you've argued that yours was a very stable one, and on basis of evidence you presented, it looks the case. They could take that risk with that, or they could actually take the guarantee from the British government.
Correct.
And how critical do you think that is to the story that then you have unfolded before us this morning?
It's absolutely central.
Why is that, Mr. O'Brien, in your view?
It's the whole point, because the commercial reality... Well, let me put it another way, and you've asked me to put it in layman's terms. If Bankwest wasn't sold, if Bankwest stood on its own 2 feet, they would have been crawling over broken glass to renew this loan, to roll it over, to settle the pre-sales, reduce the debt, further stabilise the project. That is standard banking commercial procedure, and I'm sure you can just see the mathematics of that. It's just obvious to do. It's very unusual. In fact, I think it's unprecedented where a major bank has taken over another bank with that kind of guarantee under those circumstances, and they just couldn't resist the temptation to take the easy way out. And it is actually very simple. In layman's terms, it is no different at all to your Mercedes getting a bit of a dent and a scratch on it, and you take it down to your mate at the panel beaters, and he said, let's write this off and we'll collect the money from AMP. That's what they did.
I think people will understand that, sadly. They might understand that a little bit more clearly. You then spoke about your communication with the CBA.
Or lack thereof.
Or lack thereof in the period that followed this. You also indicated you had Mallisons
Yep.
operating as your financial advisors, legal advisors
yeah.
regarding matters of finance at that
Yeah.
time. Could you point to a correspondence trail between Mallisons and the CBA?
Yes.
How many communications did you endeavour to have with the CBA?
Oh, well, lots. I mean, it was, as you can imagine... Well, let me go back to Mallisons.
Yep.
We used Mallisons deliberately as a prestige, large, highly respected firm, and in fact our lawyer at Mallisons who handled this matter for us was Michael Allen, who was a senior property partner, now retired, extremely reputable and capable property lawyer. And he was acting for us all the way through on all the sales contracts, so all these $106 million in sales were the subject of very tight contracts by Mallisons and enforceable contracts, and there were 10% deposits sitting in their trust account, so there was tens of millions of dollars there ready to be collected. At the conclusion of the project in November, 28th of November 08, as I've said repeatedly, our clear imperative was to settle the pre-sales. To settle the pre-sales without getting too technical, you have to register the strata plan,
Yes.
send notices out, and in Queensland do what they call rediscovery, where you have to notify the purchasers of the physically completed product.
That it exists, yes.
That it exists, which it did and does, and go through the process. Now, unfortunately, it was Christmas, and we all know what happens at Christmas time in Australia, but despite that, we were working assiduously through that, and Mallisons couldn't get answers from Bankwest or CBA on certain crucial elements relating to that lodgement of the strata plan so that we could trigger settlements and get going. And they were frustrated by it, and in fact wrote to them. There were several letters, but I think I've got one of them here somewhere.
So people had purchased to the value of $106 million worth of property.
Correct.
In a completed project.
Correct.
At the end of 2008, November when it was completed. You were holding, or Mallisons in a trust account were holding 10% deposits.
Correct.
For that $106 million. And when this whole thing fell apart, this is the part I find it really quite difficult to understand.
Well, it didn't fall apart, it was assassinated, but yes. go
Yeah,
on.
so depending on your perspective, come May, there was a significant moment where things changed, and the bank, although it had the property, didn't undertake any sales or complete those sales. So there's $106 million waiting to be secured, but the bank chose not to go ahead with those purchases.
Correct.
Who had indicated. Okay, so that's the first thing. There's $106 million there that they didn't go after.
Yep.
You also said that the deal that you had secured with ESC
Yep.
was another opportunity for further funds to make this deal work.
Yep.
The CBA did not pursue that either.
Correct.
What's the value of that, Mr. O'Brien, in your view?
There's two elements to it. There's cash flow and there's value. The cash flow was projected to be $10 million per annum,
Yes.
growing to $20 million per annum over 5 years
Okay.
on their projections. But the value, the true value in property development terms of having one of the wealthiest families in the world endorse your project and come and operate it and give it the credibility, the enormous credibility, particularly under those circumstances, is invaluable. And it's like dominoes. By settling those pre-sales that you're referring to, the 106 million, and there were really high net worth, high profile people amongst those people who had bought, it sets benchmark valuations. So regardless of deteriorating market conditions, you have a line in the sand where you say, well, I'm sorry, that one sold for that, that one sold for that, that one sold for that. So it was further buttressing the stability of the project. So it's like a deck of cards. If you start taking the bottom cards out, you will have devastating...
I want to note there that I'd like to find out a little bit more about the Middle East Investment Fund, but I don't think we're going to have time for that. So if I've only got one more question, could I take you to the latter part of your evidence where you spoke about the experience of your interactions with CBA around the court case,
Yep.
particularly with regard to the settlement process? You spoke about the court case you lost in April 2012 with McDougall. 2013 you won, and there was a matter of 40,000 costs. Could I take you again to your claim that CBA lied to the sheriff and said that Bankwest was responsible for that debt, of which was a finding in your favour of costs?
Yes.
For that particular piece of litigation? Yeah.
Following the takeover of Bankwest by CBA, you can imagine the machinations. It was a big, complex deal, and we were in the process of having our court case underway during that period. CBA formally notified the courts that our matter should not be against Bankwest, it should be against CBA, because CBA had assumed all of the property rights, obligations, liabilities and assets of Bankwest and were the owners of Bankwest. They also notified that publicly in the press. So when the sheriff went down to CBA's head office to collect the money, the sheriff was hoodwinked into believing that, sorry, this is a Bankwest matter, it's not CBA.
That's pretty extraordinary, Mr. O'Brien. That is almost unbelievable that a sheriff would go to a bank the size of Commonwealth Bank, where people go and do their business every day, and that somebody would actually lie to the sheriff and tell them it wasn't their responsibility.
I have other adjectives other than extraordinary, but yeah.
So,
can I read you something briefly?
Will it help explain perhaps a cultural problem which seems to be at the heart of what is being put on the record today?
It's not cultural, they're crooks.
Would you like to be a little bit more direct, Mr. O'Brien?
I could be, but decorum precludes me from doing it.
No, perhaps you can read the piece of material you think is important.
Judge slams CBA delay. New South Wales Supreme Court judges condemned the Commonwealth Bank for trying to delay a payment of $39,000 costs order in a dispute with property developer Rory. Judge John Sackar said CBA would be better advised to tackle the main proceedings against the aggrieved customer rather than wasting its time and money. I would have thought that legal fees that are going to be incurred by a bank or have already been incurred probably make it an absolute waste of everybody's time, Justice Sackar said. What is wrong with banks paying what they owe? The court was hearing a bizarre offshoot of a case involving myself, CBA and Bankwest suing O'Brien for $160 million, etc., etc. After Mr O'Brien won an interim cost order of $39,000 remained unpaid, he sent the sheriff into the CBA's headquarters in Sussex Street in Sydney to seize property to the value of the debt. The sheriff was sent away by Richard Jakeman, an administrative assistant of CBA Chief Executive Ian Narrov, who said all the goods at the building belonged to CBA, not the judgment debtor or Bankwest. This was despite CBA placing advertisements in October last year to say that all Bankwest assets and liabilities had been taken over by CBA. They'd also advised the court formally in that regard so that we had to redirect our case against CBA rather than Bankwest.
I mean, one of the arguments that I understand is put is that, of course, there were many more impaired loans in Bankwest because they were at the fringe, and essentially they took took the most risky customers whom you would expect would be in default. So presumably you went to Bankwest because you'd find it difficult to get money anywhere else.
No, not at all. I was a long-term customer of Westpac and had discussions with Westpac and had an offer from Westpac. I had two offers from Westpac. Bankwest deal was slightly better. That's just a commercial consideration. I think it's also, Senator, important to point this out, that, and I've heard that statement many times repeated, what we're losing sight of here is the catastrophic effect of the GFC, when the whole goalposts of commercial enterprise globally were changed. It's very easy then to point fingers backwards and saying, well, people took unnecessary risk, be they banks or individuals or anybody else. People were made to look foolish. Not because they were foolish or irresponsible in any way, shape or form, because we'd had a seismic event the scale of which the world had never seen, and hopefully doesn't see again, other than the Great Depression perhaps. So our deal was stable. Despite that, we were stable, because we'd got on the initiative when we'd gone to the Middle East and we'd raised massive support and massive amounts of money. So any inference, I know it's not coming from you, that we were somehow a desperate customer who got last-minute desperate financing is absolute nonsense. And it's merely smoke and mirrors and a post-rationalisation and reverse engineering to justify what they've done.
It's very helpful to have that evidence, but can I just then go on to some of the other statements you've made? I've got documents, some of them confidential, some of them which we've got to look at. And so the difficulty I've got is when I hear these statements, I want to try and corroborate what you are saying from presumably the documents that are before us. So I've really got two questions. One goes to your statement that in relation to the settlement discussions, Bankwest was instructed to go hard. Who instructed Bankwest to go hard? That's the evidence you've given us. And where do I find corroboration of that?
I don't know who instructed them to go hard, and in black and white terms, I can't give you corroboration. That statement came from David Greenberg, solicitor looking after it at Ashurst on behalf of CBA.
So the evidence is that Mr. Greenberg made that assertion in the discussions with you.
Correct.
and your representatives.
Correct.
So presumably if he contested it, it'd be a question of his word against yours.
Correct.
Now, in relation to the Ernst & Young decision in relation to clawback, where do I... in these documents, is there the Ernst & Young decision?
No, those, as I mentioned in my statement, a lot of this evidence came out through discovery in my case, and they're part of discovery evidence, which isn't before you, but can be.
Well, I think it's very important that if there is a decision where those statements are made very clearly, that it is brought to our attention.
Yeah.
So, Mr. O'Brien, can I request then that even if it's provided confidentially, that any written evidence that clearly substantiates those decisions by both Ernst & Young and KPMG about the stable nature of your loan is provided to the committee?
Yes, Senator. Senator, I'm not sure how we practically go about it because, as I said, this was part of my case, and as such, subsequent to the settlement, all of those documents went back to the bank.
Case, and they can test it when we summons it from you.
Thank you.
They can dispute it.
Yeah. So I no longer have the documents is the answer.
If you can identify the time period, the nature that will identify the documents, we can summons or appropriately request those documents.
We can do that.
Thank you. Mr. Ruddock.
Now, in your statement that I did in fact have a chance to read on the plane, pursuant to the provisions of the sale contract, the CBA did in fact attempt to claw back our loan from the vendors. So I'm really, again, pursuant to the provisions of the sale contract.
Yes.
What provisions are they and where do I find them?
In the sale deed between CBA and Bankwest.
So these are the provisions that have been brought to our attention in other submissions, clause 2.
I believe that's
something,
the one, Senator, yes. Yeah.
D.
Yes.
Yeah,
You've got a good memory.
Okay. I've seen that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Senator.
Senator Williams.
Thanks, Mr. O'Brien. Thanks, Chair. It's valued at 350 million, this establishment, this building. It was reduced to 255 million. Who did the valuation, Mr. O'Brien?
Savills.
Savills, okay. You had $106 million deposits, 10% as Senator O'Neill has pointed out, signed, sealed and delivered.
Correct.
Go ahead. I want to bring you to a point that I've been on about for a long time. It's Section 428 of the Corporations Act, which is part of the terms of reference to this inquiry. How people, when they sell off assets, must get the best possible price they can. Advertise it correctly, put it to auction, leave it, get the proper market price. Why would Corda Mentha have not proceeded with those $106 million worth of sales, is a question I ask.
Well, it's not only a good question, it's a burning question because it doesn't make any sense whatsoever, and I don't know the answer other than to speculate that it didn't suit CBA's agenda to claw back the loan from the British government. It was the easy way out.
You're alleging that the Commonwealth Bank got the whole $179 million back by taking it off. A clawback you're saying about the purchase of Bankwest.
I believe, let me go back a step. Corda Mentha failed to settle any one of the $106 million in pre-sales. Corda Mentha advertised the completed project for sale and sold it in one line.
For how much?
56 million, which is half, roughly, the 106 million we already had, and a third of its valuation.
I'll follow that up with ASIC because they must report to ASIC. Corda Mentha actually liquidated Ansett. Took 10 years to do it. It was a long, drawn-out program. Yeah. And 7 of the 10 years ASIC excluded Corda Mentha from reporting to them on Ansett. So we'll find out whether they actually report on this, because I just find it amazing. There's a lot of the complaints I've had since the 7 years I've been in the Senate where people have gone belly up for whatever reason we don't know, or do know in some reasons. Their assets seem to be fire sold, which to me is very unfair, and I think this is another situation here where if what you say, Mallison's had deposits, 10%, signed contracts, the purchase of $106 million worth, and they sell a whole building for 56, that's amazing.
It's terrifying.
You made what I'd call a very strong statement when you said that in a discussion with Mr. Cohen said we're doing this because of the clawback, or words to that effect?
Correct. He said we're anxious to settle with you, or we're keen to settle with you because you're one of the ones we tried to claw back. Inference being that he didn't want it to go to court on the following Monday.
Okay, well, in a settlement, I've seen the statement here, joint statement of the Commonwealth Bank and Rory O'Brien. Are you saying you were forced to sign that, and yet is everything in that statement true?
No, it's totally false.
Totally false?
Totally false.
So you had a verbal agreement to settle for 1.8 million. You end up settling for, 100,000. Had you withdrawn your court action when they agreed on the 1.8 million?
No, that was on the Tuesday before the case was due to start the following Monday. And from that day, we effectively had to withdraw action because there's a series of documentary procedures you have to provide to the court during that period, and Justice Hammerschlag was demanding that we do so, and so we effectively stopped from that date, with the promise from CBA that the paperwork would be done within 24 hours.
And with this allegation of the clawback, etc., Leon Swire was your solicitor?
Correct.
Was he present when that was said?
Yep.
Given
Could I
the
just
time.
take you back, Mr. O'Brien, to you had a long delay where you were hoping to reduce your debt by settling the pre-sales, and my understanding from your evidence was that you were unable to do that because you needed certain advice from the Commonwealth to provide to the Queensland authorities in order to say to your purchasers that the project was complete.
Correct.
So for Corda Mentha to be able to settle those pre-sales, they would have needed that same advice.
Correct.
So did they have that advice at the time when they sold the project for $56 million?
I don't know the answer to that, Senator. I don't know whether they did or not.
Okay, so potentially in terms of Corda Mentha's conduct, if they did not have that advice from the Commonwealth, if they were suffering the same lack of cooperation, then they would be unable to settle the pre-sales for the same reason you were unable to. And therefore, potentially they were selling a completed project that was not actually yet able to be sold because it didn't have that completion advice. So there were liabilities associated with it. I'm just trying to understand here whether this is an issue with a lack of cooperation from the Commonwealth, or whether this was something that Court of Mentha was operating under instructions, or whether they were just limited by what they had available to them to try and action.
I don't believe so, because the project physically sits complete. There it is. We happen to have $100 million of sales to settle, but I would imagine, and I'm speculating, that Court of Mentha's options were to immediately get the instructions from their masters about the technical aspects of redisclosure. It's just a process that you could have pushed the button in 5 minutes. So why they didn't, if they wanted to, why they didn't push that button, proceed down that path, I don't know. And I don't even know whether they did or didn't. But there's nothing to preclude them from doing it, just like there was nothing to preclude them from doing it with me. There's no cost involved. It's just simply a decision. We want to go this way, proceed on that basis, bang, 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 off you go, settle the pre-sales. But even if they didn't want to settle the pre-sales for some unfathomable other reason, you might still do that merely to establish the strata title nature of it. That would be a sensible thing to do. And I don't know whether they strated it then or subsequently or at all.
Sure.
But it
Well,
wouldn't.
they might say we wanted to test the market because we could get a better price, possibly, and we did, and we didn't get the better price. Terribly sorry.
That's possible. Yes.
Mr. O'Brien, you were building these were units and apartments. Did you change your decision during the process to include a hotel resort as you went along your project?
Didn't change the decision, changed the
The plan.
characterisation.
So in other words, the units and apartments were after you'd started the project and then gone to stage of including a hotel in it. Is that correct?
Correct.
What was the bank's response, Bankwest, when you put that proposition to them?
I'm very keen to participate, and they provided another $10 million to do it.
All right.
That was in April 2007.
So the bank never expressed any concerns about including the hotel in the resort?
Not at all.
The resort hotel in the units?
Not at all.
Can I just ask you if you're aware of a thing called Project Magellan?
Subsequent to my case, yes.
Okay, so correct me if I'm wrong, but Project Magellan was actually the project within the sale of Bankwest to Commonwealth to assess the relative merits of loans. Is that a fair way to characterise it?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to just read some statements to you for your further explanation to us. So this is a review of bad loans, the internal project called Project Magellan. When you undertake these projects, there's an opportunity for some independent assessor to come in and have a look and see about how good the loan is. So I think IA refers to that.
Yep.
There were obviously people who were involved in this process. And now I'm quoting, the results of the project were announced and each BDM got a list of 3 files, a list of files they needed to action as per below. And a BDM, I'm assuming, means a business district or business development manager.
I think so.
So there are 3. The first one was risk rating of 8 or more, scale is 1 to 10. $10 million with a double red to be transferred to CAMS by 15th of July. Point 2, risk rating 7 or more and green to be actioned by the line in accordance with recommendation by Magellan, 31 December. And then red or double red to be actioned by the line in accordance with a recommendation made by Magellan at the end of September. Not sure on number, but my contact suggests there were 5 in their set, so best guess was maybe 500 nationally. Green means high risk but no default yet. Red means non-monetary default, mostly expired facilities, and double red means both monetary and non-monetary. What is important here is action by the line means in most cases obtaining an IA report and liaising with credit to determine if the file can be repatriated or needs to be escalated. How long and short of this that the line, not CAMS or credit, will be required to appoint hundreds of IAs in the next few months. The bankers are furious as they say many of the files are fine and the cost is going to kill their clients. A number of senior guys I've known for years have resigned in Sydney. in the last week or so, many gone to, and there's a number of banks that are named there. A person is named, I won't put it on the record today. Somebody has apparently tried to line up to do all the IAs, but the bankers are revolting, so they have conflict and should not do any work on these files as they made the recommendations. This is the part that I found most alarming. The bankers will be wanting, and then it's in inverted commas, quick and dirty, end of inverted commas, IAs for approximately $10,000 to $15,000, with the hope of recommendation is to do nothing more. This is clearly a business opportunity that somebody sees and communicates to another. What does this actually mean, Mr. O'Brien, and how does it relate to what you've told us this morning so far?
It's entirely consistent with what I've told the committee this morning. What it means is that once CBA took over Bankwest, is they were having a look at the books and to do quick and dirties on a whole raft of loans and customers to try and change their rating and to put them into receivership and for receivers to deal with those loans.
So when you say quick, the quick bit is do a very prompt assessment. And how would that be undertaken? Would they look at the people's books and go into some detail, or would they just send somebody to drive by and make an assessment of the property? Would they engage valuers? What do they do?
I wasn't there. I don't know what they did, but I know what quick and dirty means to me, and it's not a considered professional forensic review of anything. And in my case, I think and I repeat, it's absolutely extraordinary. I owe a bank $178 million. A new master and a new owner comes in and they do not have a single word to say to me, to meet me, to view my project, to see if I'm a responsible person, to look at my books, to ask any questions whatsoever for a 5-month period. I think it's extraordinary. I think it's unbelievable, and I don't believe it. I was dead man walking the day they took it over.
Thank you, Mr. O'Brien.